Flaxborough had always taken a quiet pride in the predictability of its comings and goings. Market days were measured by the precise number of apples on Mrs. Gillingham's stall, the subtle shift in Mr. Frobisher's bowler hat, and the exact volume of complaints about the railway buffet's new marmalade. It was, by all accounts, a town that abhorred surprises until, on a Wednesday, that began with unusually persistent drizzle, a most curious event quietly unsettled the ordinary rhythm. It occurred at the Regent Street Emporium, where Mrs. Dalloway, proprietor of the shop and perpetual host of small indignities, was supervising her assistants. At precisely 10:15, a man arrived, a stranger, unmistakably out of place yet modest in bearing. He was the sort of gentleman who, in Flaxborough, might have been mistaken for an accountant recently arrived from London, except that he looked vaguely apologetic and carried a coat that, in some indefinable way, did not belong to him. "Good morning," he said politely, speaking with a faintly northern accent. "I wonder if I might leave this coat while I inspect your new display of tweed scarves." Mrs. Dalloway, who prided herself on the neatness of her coat-check procedure, raised an eyebrow. "Certainly, sir. May I take it?" The stranger handed over the coat. Its fabric was fine, almost too fine for Flaxborough standards. Dark charcoal, slightly worn at the elbows, with brass buttons that had been polished to a muted gleam. Mrs. Dalloway's fingers, trained to detect even the slightest imperfection, hesitated over the cuff. "Is this, your own?" she inquired, a trace of curiosity lacing her otherwise neutral tone. "It is not mine exactly," he replied, and there was a flicker of something, hesitation, embarrassment, that made Mrs. Dalloway shift her stance ever so slightly. Well, I believe it belongs to someone who will be visiting shortly. I was asked to return it." Now Flaxborough rarely dealt in mislaid possessions. A returned umbrella, a stray handbag, perhaps a forgotten book, but a coat, and one that was ostensibly meant for someone else. The idea set the shop's small world into a brief but discernible spin. "Of course, sir," said Mrs. Dalloway, hiding both surprise and suspicion behind a polite smile. "We shall keep it safely until the rightful owner arrives." As the stranger wandered among the scarves, examining them with an air of someone both familiar and entirely foreign to the surroundings, Mrs. Dalloway's assistant, Miss Pettigrew, whispered, "I don't like him, ma'am. There's something odd about him. You can feel it." Mrs. Dalloway, though tempted to agree, simply pursed her lips. "Odd is scarcely a crime, Miss Pettigrew. Let us see how the day unfolds." By noon, the news of the coat had rippled through the town with the velocity typical of Flaxborough gossip. At the Royal Oak, the landlord noted the peculiarity with a dry chuckle. "A stranger returns a coat he swears is not his own. Odd, eh? That's the sort of thing that makes a Tuesday interesting, though we're on a Wednesday." By the time the town clerk, Mr. Abernathy, had received an unsolicited account over tea from a neighbour, speculation had multiplied. It was a gift, a misunderstanding, or possibly a theft foiled in progress. No one as yet suspected a crime, but the air was, for the first time in many months, tinged with something slightly askew. And somewhere beyond the town's gossiping circles, quietly observing and noting, was Inspector Purbright. He had arrived that morning with his usual small satchel and polite manners, ostensibly to inspect a series of minor complaints about the library's new lighting. But Flaxborough, as ever, had a way of diverting his attention. The report of a coat returned by a stranger, while outwardly trivial, carried the subtle scent of misalignment in the social order, just the sort of whisper that would prompt Perbrite to lean forward slightly, half-smile, and begin his patient watching. By 3 o'clock the coat was still in the shop, unattended, and the stranger had vanished. Mrs. Dalloway checked the clasped pockets for some note, a name, a card, anything, but found nothing. Only a faint trace of tobacco smoke lingered in the fabric, mild, almost innocuous, yet suggestive of a life lived elsewhere. And so it began, an event that was at first glance entirely mundane, yet set in motion a quiet disturbance in Flaxborough's carefully maintained order. By the following morning, Flaxborough had already turned the stranger and his coat into a topic of quiet fascination. Gossip, as always, travelled faster than truth. At Mrs. Dalloway's shop, the conversation over the scarves had shifted into a subtle examination of human character. Miss Pettigrew, still uneasy, confided to a curious customer, "He looked altogether too careful. Not careless, you understand, but the sort who might misplace things on purpose." Mrs. Dalloway merely nodded. "Curiosity, my dear, should always be tempered with observation." She had said it often enough in the past that even Miss Pettigrew had begun to suspect it was a motto for the shop as much as advice. Outside, the market square was alive with a gentler form of speculation. Mr. Larkins, the florist, had already composed a narrative that positioned the stranger as a mysterious benefactor. Perhaps he left the coat for someone who'd lost it. An eccentric, charitable fellow, eh? Very romantic, he mused to Mrs. Thistle, who preferred the coat to be a cipher for scandal. Or, she countered, perhaps he is involved in some shady business, returning stolen goods to throw us off. You can never tell with strangers. By mid-morning, even the railway buffet had caught wind of the story. Patrons sipped tea and speculated with their customary solemnity. Mr. Frobisher, who fancied himself an amateur psychologist, declared that the coat's very material, so different from anything locally produced, signalled a foreign influence of subtle but undeniable significance. The waitress, who knew better than to contradict him, merely smiled, scribbling down the order for a slice of sponge cake, yet inwardly entertained the notion that the stranger's brief presence had injected a tincture of adventure into their otherwise predictable day. At the council offices, the town clerk, Mr. Abernathy, had drafted a brief note to the police, citing the unattended coat of unusual provenance and requesting a discreet inquiry. This note, penned with the solemnity Flaxborough reserved for minor emergencies, set a formal tone beneath the informal speculation that had already engulfed the town. Purbright, who had passed through the square that morning with the quiet composure that distinguished his style, noted the undercurrents with the mildest of smiles. He did not intervene. Town gossip was often the first stage of a case, revealing more about human nature than even the most meticulous reports. Observing the floral arrangements, the subtle exchanges over tea, and the precise way Mr. Frobisher adjusted his bowler hat each time the conversation turned to the stranger, Perbrite filed away small pieces of behaviour with his habitual patience. By afternoon, the story had mutated further. The butcher, Mr. Yates, suggested to anyone who would listen that the coat might carry some sort of message, concealed, secret, perhaps a signal for a clandestine meeting. Mrs. Dalloway, overhearing this while rearranging her new display of shawls, thought it an exaggeration, yet she could not suppress a moment's curiosity about the small brass buttons. They gleamed in the light, polished almost to a whisper of a reflection, yet their origin remained unknown. Even children contributed, though without fully understanding the stakes. Young Timothy Hodge had claimed that the stranger had smiled at him in a very secretive way, and that perhaps he was a spy or a magician. This caused no small stir among the shopkeepers, who decided quietly that it was better to indulge the child's imagination than to correct him. Perbrite, moving from one gathering point to the next with deliberate slowness, noted all of this without comment. He understood the town's rhythm too well to disrupt it, and he had learned that the truth often emerged from the intersection of petty conjecture and human error. Each exaggerated story, each fearful glance, and each over-interpreted smile formed a lattice of social behaviour, ready for his quiet analysis. By evening, the coat remained unclaimed. Mrs. Dalloway, mindful of her duty, locked it in a cupboard behind the counter, feeling the weight of curiosity pressing against her sense of propriety. She noticed, with a discreet twinge of unease, that the coat seemed heavier than it should have been. Perhaps the lining carried some hidden object, she thought briefly, and dismissed the notion with a small shake of the head. Flaxborough did not do extraordinary, yet on this day even the ordinary felt strangely elastic, as if stretched by unseen hands. Perbrite, returning to his lodgings, took the precaution of noting every observation in his small ledger. The whispers of the town, the subtle clues embedded in clothing, gestures, and mismatched priorities, all suggested that the stranger had disturbed more than just the shop's tidy routines. It was, as he recorded, a quiet anomaly, but anomalies often concealed patterns, and patterns, as he well knew, revealed truths. The town had reacted. The gossip was now in circulation, and the curious had found their narratives. What remained was for Purbright to follow the thread gently, unhurriedly, and in such a manner that the town would scarcely realize he was at work, until the truth, delivered with his customary calm, quietly emerged. Perbrite began the day with his customary slow walk along Regent Street, not for exercise but to observe. The mist lingered in the early morning, clinging to the eaves and window sills, giving the town an almost conspiratorial hush. Flaxborough, in its usual way, seemed to be holding its breath. The coat remained unclaimed at Mrs. Dalloway's shop, and this fact, small though it was, became Purbright's first point of inquiry. He entered the shop with a polite nod, greeted by Mrs. Dalloway's faintly nervous smile. "Inspector, you are early." "Merely observant, Mrs. Dalloway," Perbrite replied. "I thought I might see how the town is adjusting to unusual circumstances." His eyes rested for a moment on the locked cupboard where the coat lay. "Would you mind if I ask a few questions about the gentleman who left it?" Mrs. Dalloway nodded, clearing her throat. "Of course. He was very polite, Inspector, and quite quiet. He didn't say much about himself, only that the coat should be returned to someone arriving later. He seemed in a bit of a hurry, though not impatient." "And the coat itself?" Perbrite asked, inclining his head toward the cupboard. "Fine fabric, dark charcoal with brass buttons. He handled it with great care, I noticed, but—" She hesitated. "It was heavier than one might expect. Perhaps there's something in the lining. I didn't dare look." Perbrite made a small note, filing away the weight of the coat as a potential clue. "And did you notice any distinguishing features in the gentleman? Anything peculiar about his manner or his speech?" Mrs. Dalloway thought for a moment. "His voice, rather formal, though not stiff." He smiled just briefly, and there was a kind of deliberate calm about him. One felt he was hiding nothing, yet somehow leaving everything unsaid. Satisfied with this initial account, Purbright moved on to the next logical source, the shop's assistant, Miss Pettigrew. She was eager to talk, perhaps too eager, spilling a stream of observations with the enthusiasm of someone finally feeling part of the intrigue. "I thought him strange, Inspector. He seemed to notice everything but say very little. And he smelled faintly of tobacco, though not heavily, more like a trace, as if trying to be unremarkable." Perbrite nodded, his expression unchanged. He recorded the detail quietly, aware that human habits often betrayed more than words. "Thank you, Miss Pettigrew. Did he give any indication of when the owner would arrive?" "Oh, no, not exactly. He just said they'd be along at some point." She giggled nervously. It was all rather mysterious, really. One does enjoy a little mystery in Flaxborough, though of course one mustn't speculate too wildly. From the shop, Purbright wandered toward the Royal Oak, a natural centre for social observation. There, Mr. Larkins was already recounting the coat story to an audience of half-amused and half-concerned locals. Perbrite listened, allowing Larkins to embellish freely. The florist described the stranger as a man of refined presence, possibly literary, perhaps carrying some message of great import. The embellishment was subtle, rooted in Larkin's desire for adventure within the town's confines. Purbright's inquiries at the pub were brief, polite, and carefully non-committal. He asked only a few questions. Had anyone seen the man before? Did anyone know of anyone expecting a coat? No one could answer with certainty. The truth, for now, was suspended in a lattice of polite speculation. By late afternoon, Perbrite had moved on to the council offices, where Mr. Abernathy greeted him with mild formality. The town clerk had already drafted his note to the police and was anxious to discuss what he considered an unusual development. "Inspector, the matter may be trivial, but one cannot ignore any anomaly in Flaxborough. A mislaid coat could signify, well, anything." Perbrite raised an eyebrow, but said nothing. Instead, he asked about recent arrivals to the town, any visitors of note, and whether anyone had reported a missing coat. Abernathy supplied a small list of visitors from the past week, none of whom matched the stranger exactly. It was during this quiet inquiry that a subtle contradiction emerged. Mrs. Dalloway had mentioned the weight of the coat, Miss Pettigrew noted the faint scent of tobacco, and Mr. Larkins suggested literary refinement. Each detail on its own seemed trivial, but taken together they suggested a man who moved deliberately, cared about appearances, and possibly concealed a private purpose. Purbright filed these impressions alongside the whispers of the town, noting how often appearances in Flaxborough betrayed more than their owners intended. As evening fell, Purbright returned to his lodgings, his mind quietly assembling the puzzle. He did not rush, nor did he commit to any premature theory. The coat, the stranger, and the lattice of small-town reactions had created a subtle disturbance, and in Flaxborough, he knew, it was precisely these disturbances that revealed the truth, not loudly, not with fanfare, but quietly, in the cracks of civility, in gestures, and in half-spoken words. By the following morning, Flaxborough had collectively settled on an explanation, or at least the semblance of one, for the stranger and his mislaid coat. It was, naturally, the simplest and most convenient theory. The coat belonged to Mr. Pargeter, the retired magistrate who had spent the past week visiting London on matters of undisclosed importance. Everyone agreed that a coat returned by an anonymous stranger could only belong to him. The theory gained traction almost immediately. Mrs. Dalloway mentioned it to a customer, who mentioned it to the baker, whose apprentice passed it on to Mr. Larkins at the florist. By mid-morning, the Royal Oak hummed with the certainty that Mr. Pargeter was the rightful owner, and that the mystery of the coat was therefore resolved. Even the town clerk, Mr. Abernathy, allowed himself a small sigh of relief. Purbright, however, listened with his usual restraint, letting the town's assumptions develop naturally while he conducted his own quiet observations. He had yet to speak to Mr. Pargeter himself, and something in the neatness of the town's eagerness made him cautious. Human assumptions, he knew, were far more revealing than any fabric, and a prematurely adopted conclusion could obscure subtler truths. He arranged to call on the retired magistrate that afternoon. Mr. Pargeter received him in his drawing-room with the courteous attention reserved for former officers of the law. The room smelled faintly of polished wood and old leather, a scent Perbrite associated with habitual control and meticulous habit. "Inspector Perbrite, how good of you to visit," Mr. Pargeter said, bowing slightly. I hear there has been some confusion about a coat." "Yes, sir," Perbright replied, politely surveying the room before taking a seat. "A coat has been left at Mrs. Dalloway's shop by a gentleman who said it should be returned to someone. Naturally, Flaxborough's curiosity has been piqued, and it has been assumed, rather quickly, that it belongs to you." Mr. Pargeter's eyes twinkled faintly, though his expression remained guarded. "Ah, well, that is flattering. But I fear it is a mistake. I have been in London for the past week, yes, but my own coat is entirely accounted for. I purchased a new one, in fact, before my departure." He gestured to a neatly hung garment by the window, perfectly matching the description of the coat he claimed was his own. Perbrite nodded, noting the polite firmness in Mr. Pargeter's voice and the absence of hesitation that might suggest deception. Yet there was the smallest hint of impatience, a micro-gesture invisible to most, but easily observed by someone, trained to see beyond words. "Interesting," Perbrite said, choosing his words carefully. "So the coat remains unclaimed despite local conjecture. Did you happen to notice any peculiar visitors or acquaintances who might have been returning items on your behalf?" "No one," Mr. Pargeter replied, the single word delivered with clipped precision. "If someone sought to return a coat to me, I am unaware of it. Flaxborough does enjoy its mysteries, Inspector, but I assure you, this is not one I have any part in creating." Perbrite made a quiet note. The retired magistrate's denials, delivered with polite authority, were credible, but that very credibility could mask subtle truths. As always, it was not what was said, but how it was said, and the glimmer of impatience, the micro-adjustment of a cuff, that drew Perbrite's attention. By the time he left, the town had largely embraced the neat solution. The coat must belong to Mr. Pargeter, and all uncertainty could be considered resolved. Yet Purbright, walking slowly back through Regent Street, observed small incongruities: a shop window slightly misaligned, a scrap of thread caught on a railing, and a faint trace of tobacco lingering near the pavement outside the florist's door. He did not rush. He did not challenge the town's assumptions. Instead, he allowed the neat story to settle while keeping his attention focused on the details that contradicted the surface explanation. Human nature, he reflected, was rarely satisfied with simplicity, and the weight of a coat, the faintest scent, and the micro-expressions of an elderly magistrate could be the beginning of a far more interesting story. The town had found its obvious suspect. Perbrite had not. And in that quiet gap between assumption and observation, the mystery waited. Perbrite returned to Mrs. Dalloway's shop the following morning, not because he had any new instructions from the town clerk, nor because anyone had requested further inquiry, but because the small unease stirred in him by the coat demanded attention. The shop was quieter than usual, the midweek lull tempered by the lingering rumours that had already begun to evolve in unpredictable directions. As he stood near the locked cupboard, observing the coat through the glass of the counter, his eye caught something almost imperceptible, a small crease at the shoulder seam, as though the coat had been hastily folded or shoved into a tight space before being handed over. The detail was trivial to anyone else, yet it suggested movement inconsistent with a simple return. Perbrite leaned slightly, noting that the brass buttons were not uniformly polished. One, near the cuff, bore a faint smudge of dirt, a mark that might easily have gone unnoticed except to a trained observer. "Inspector," Mrs. Dalloway said, approaching from behind the counter, "I hope you're not implying—" "Not implying, Mrs. Dalloway, merely observing," Perbrite replied, allowing his gaze to remain on the coat. "It is remarkable how small details can suggest a story entirely different from the one the town has adopted." Miss Pettigrew, hovering nearby, whispered, "Do you mean someone has perhaps taken the coat somewhere before leaving it?" "Possibly," Perbrite said quietly. He did not elaborate, knowing that conjecture often distorted the truth more than it revealed it. Instead, he continued to examine the coat, turning it slightly, feeling its weight once more. It was heavier than one might expect for its size, but not unnaturally so, suggesting perhaps that the lining contained something else, or that the fabric had absorbed moisture or dust during its journey. He asked Mrs. Dalloway a few practical questions. Had the coat been touched by anyone else since its arrival? Were there any signs of damage or alteration? Each answer, polite and precise, served to reinforce that the coat had been handled carefully, yet the small crease and smudge remained unexplained. As he left the shop, Purbright's attention was caught by the tiniest irregularity in the market square, a brass button lying on the cobblestones near the florist's stall. He stooped to examine it. It was not identical to the ones on the coat, but the similarity suggested that the owner, or someone handling the garment, was unusually meticulous about appearance, yet imperfect in execution. He pocketed the button carefully, noting how such trivialities often provided far more insight than overt clues. Walking through the misty lanes of Flaxborough, Purbright reflected on human nature. People, he thought, were rarely as consistent as they appeared. The magistrate's polite denial, the town's eager conclusion, even the stranger's understated manners, all suggested a pattern of behavior that could easily mislead. Yet in the minutiae, the crease, the smudge, the misplaced button, there were hints of intention, however small. By evening, he had compiled his observations. Nothing was dramatic, nothing conclusive, but a quiet shift had occurred. The neat explanation centered on Mr. Pargeter was no longer entirely sufficient. The trivial, odd details had created a small fissure in the town's certainty, one that Perbrite intended to explore with patience and precision. In Flaxborough, he knew, the extraordinary was most often revealed in the most ordinary of objects, and a coat, heavier than it seemed, with a tiny smudge and a mysterious crease, was an excellent place to begin. The following morning, Perbrite set out to widen his observations beyond the confines of the shop and the magistrate's drawing-room. Flaxborough, as ever, thrived on connections, small alliances, whispered grievances, and carefully cultivated impressions. If the coat had quietly unsettled the town, then examining those ripples promised far more insight than any direct questioning might yield. He began at the Royal Oak, where the public's version of events had already evolved into a narrative more elaborate than fact. Mr. Larkins, the florist, was engaged in telling a group of listeners that the stranger must surely have a story, perhaps linked to some obscure London intrigue. Perhaps, he speculated, he is a solicitor or involved with the theatre, a gentleman who returns coats, perhaps as a sort of test. Perbrite allowed a faint smile to touch his lips. Tests were a common conceit in Flaxborough conjecture, yet rarely bore any relation to reality. Still, Larkins's assumption revealed the florist's own preoccupations, a desire for drama in a town otherwise carefully confined to routine. From the pub, Perbrite moved on to those who had the closest proximity to the coat itself. Miss Pettigrew offered further observations, now more nervous than enthusiastic. "Inspector, I can't stop thinking that the crease and that smudge, they were too deliberate. He might have done it to, well, I don't know, but it felt intentional." "Intentional, perhaps," Perbrite replied, "or merely incidental. The difference is subtle and often tells us more about the observer than the observed." He next visited Mr. Frobisher, whose habit of arranging his bowler hat at exactly a 30-degree angle every few minutes suggested the careful calibration of a man who noticed the unnoticed. Frobisher had observed the stranger briefly at the market, noting that he carried himself with the kind of measured poise that invited scrutiny, yet revealed nothing definite. "There is a confidence," Frobisher said, that speaks of familiarity with both civility and discretion. It is unsettling. Purbright filed this observation quietly, recognizing that the man's confidence was, in itself, a behavioral clue, albeit one subtle enough to be missed by the less attentive. By mid-afternoon, he had visited the library, the railway buffet, and even the flower show tent in the park, where a committee was examining last year's arrangements with a level of concern that bordered on absurd. In each place, he listened, noting what was said, and, more importantly, what was left unspoken. A local baker mentioned seeing a man in a dark coat loitering near the station platform. The librarian recalled a figure who seemed to drift between sections, touching books but reading none. Small inconsistencies, mismatched observations, and overlapping timelines began to take shape in Purbright's mind. Yet, despite the variety of accounts, a pattern was emerging. All traces of the stranger pointed to careful, deliberate movement and the avoidance of direct confrontation. He had left the coat in a place highly visible yet secure, allowing multiple witnesses without compelling them to act. He had introduced ambiguity, a subtle disruption in the town's ordinary flow, yet left no overt threat or crime. By evening, Perbrite had compiled a quiet mental map. Each shop, each street, corner, each small interaction contributed to a lattice of human behavior. Some townsfolk were eager to close the case with an obvious answer. Others, like Miss Pettigrew, were troubled by intuition. And in the spaces between certainty and speculation, the truth waited, obscured by polite proprieties, minor embellishments, and the sheer ordinariness of Flaxborough life. As he returned to his lodgings, Perbrite reflected that the field of inquiry had expanded, not outwardly into chaos, but inwardly into the subtleties of human conduct. It was not yet a matter of law or detection, but of observation, tracing a stranger's careful disruption, weighing the reactions of those whose lives intersected with it, and recording with quiet patience every minor detail that suggested deviation from the expected. In Flaxborough, he knew, the extraordinary was never loud. It was found in small gestures, minor contradictions, and the subtle, almost imperceptible ways in which ordinary people adjusted to an anomaly in their routines. And for the coat, the stranger, and the unspoken purpose that accompanied them, Purbright intended to follow those quiet threads wherever they might lead. It was the following Thursday when Flaxborough experienced the second, far subtler disruption, one that caused a ripple greater than the first. The morning mist had barely lifted when Mrs. Dalloway arrived at her shop to find that the cupboard door, where the coat had been securely stored, was slightly ajar. No one had entered the shop since closing the previous evening. The coat, however, remained, but now one of the brass buttons had been detached and lay upon the counter, faintly scuffed. The discovery was trivial, yet significant. Mrs. Dalloway, never one to ignore anomalies, called Perbrite immediately. He arrived within the hour, walking with his customary unhurried step, noting the dampness in the air and the quiet hum of the market. He examined the coat carefully, then inspected the scuffed button. The weight of the fabric remained unchanged, but the missing button suggested interference. "Someone has handled it deliberately," Perbrite said softly, more to himself than to Mrs. Dalloway. "Or perhaps in haste." Miss Pettigrew, standing nearby, wrung her hands. "Inspector, I knew something would happen. I said there was intent. Look, now there's proof." Perbrite considered her enthusiasm with mild amusement. The button was indeed evidence of action, though what action and by whom remained unclear. He carefully placed it in a small envelope, noting that even in trivial objects, the human narrative was quietly inscribed. By late morning, the town had caught wind of the development. Gossip travelled faster than any formal report could. The butcher suggested that the stranger had returned once more, to confirm his purpose, or perhaps to retrieve something left behind. The florist proposed a theatrical motive, a test of civility or attentiveness. Mr. Frobisher, adjusting his bowler hat for the fourth time that morning, insisted that the missing button demonstrated subtle subterfuge. Perbrite observed each interpretation in turn, making no comment. His own mind, as ever, focused on the behaviours behind the action. A deliberate touch, a small smudge, a missing button, each suggested presence, attention, and timing. He considered who among those with access to the shop might have handled the coat, yet he did not yet question anyone directly. The movement of the coat had been quiet, controlled, and without any outward sign of alarm. Later that afternoon, he took a discreet walk past the railway station, where a porter mentioned having seen a figure in dark clothing linger near the luggage office around the same time the coat's disturbance likely occurred. The description was vague, the timing approximate, yet Purbright filed it carefully. He did not act immediately. He was content to let the evidence accumulate, understanding that the second incident had shifted the field subtly. For the first time, the neat solution centering on Mr. Pargeter appeared less certain. He had remained entirely apart from these developments, polite and precise, yet the coat now carried additional traces of interference. The question was no longer whether it belonged to him, but who else might have had the knowledge, opportunity, and motive to handle it, and to do so with such discretion that the town at large remained unaware. Returning to his lodgings that evening, Perbrite reflected on the nature of disruption in Flaxborough. The first incident had been a minor curiosity, the second a carefully measured deviation from routine. People noticed, speculated, and reassured themselves, yet none had grasped the full picture. And therein lay the advantage. The truth was quiet, almost invisible, embedded in gestures, creases, and the faintest traces left behind by human presence. Perbrite resolved to proceed with patient observation, allowing each thread of behaviour and circumstance to unravel naturally. The town, in its eagerness to assign blame or meaning, had overlooked what he already suspected. The real story was hidden in subtleties, in small actions that revealed far more than loud declarations ever could. That evening, Perbrite settled into his modest lodgings with a cup of tea, the town's distant lights shimmering through the mist. The quiet of the room offered the perfect space for reflection. The events of the past week, the arrival of the stranger, the coat, the minor interference with the garment, and the town's eager speculations had formed a lattice of human behaviour, each observation a small yet revealing clue. He allowed himself to consider the magistrate first. Mr. Pargeter was courteous, precise, and outwardly imperturbable, yet the faint micro-expressions, the slight impatience, the almost imperceptible tightening of his lips when the coat was mentioned, suggested a man accustomed to control but occasionally disrupted by circumstance. Perbrite noted this not as suspicion but as a human tendency. Even those who mastered civility left traces in minor gestures. Then there was the stranger himself, absent now, leaving only the coat and its subtle irregularities behind. Deliberate, measured, and discreet, his actions suggested knowledge of the town's rhythms, an understanding of human attention, and a preference for indirect communication. The choice of leaving the coat, rather than delivering it personally, and then disappearing, implied a carefully calculated plan, yet without overt threat or drama. Perbrite's mind lingered on the trivial yet odd details he had observed, the crease in the shoulder seam, the faint tobacco scent, the scuffed button, and the weight of the coat itself. Each was minor in isolation, yet collectively they painted a picture of purpose. Someone had handled the coat with intent, yet with caution. The sequence of events suggested a test, a message, or a small game conducted quietly within the bounds of propriety. He reflected on the townsfolk, too, Their eagerness to assign ownership and meaning had obscured subtleties, revealing more about their own expectations than the reality of events. Flaxborough, in its orderly routine and polite gossip, was fertile ground for small intrigues to flourish unnoticed. Observing this, Perbrite felt the familiar satisfaction of understanding the human condition. It was rarely loud or dramatic, often almost invisible, yet profoundly informative. The second incident, the missing button, had clarified a principle for him. The ordinary disruption, however minor, was the language of intention. The ordinary could reveal extraordinary truths if approached with patience, observation, and restraint. Perbrite knew he would need to continue listening, watching and waiting, letting the truth emerge in its own time. The town's eagerness for a tidy resolution was irrelevant. The pattern, subtle and intricate, would only reveal itself through careful attention to gesture, timing, and behavior. As he sipped his tea, Perbrite allowed himself a quiet smile. The case was far from solved, yet he had assembled the pieces in his mind: the apparent owner, the absent stranger, the interfering hand, the townsfolk's interpretations, and the trivial yet telling details of the coat itself. Each formed a thread in the broader tapestry of human action and reaction. He did not rush. That was the advantage of patience in Flaxborough. The story would continue to unfold naturally and inevitably as long as he remained attentive to the small and seemingly insignificant truths that the town overlooked. The coat, he thought, had spoken enough to begin with, but it would continue to whisper, and he would listen until the full meaning became unmistakably clear. Purbright decided the next step required subtlety rather than confrontation. The town's assumptions had settled too neatly on Mr. Pargeter, yet the coat, the crease, the missing button, and the faint scent of tobacco all suggested a different narrative, one carefully concealed. The challenge was to observe without alerting the guilty party, or parties, to the fact that they were being watched. He returned to Mrs. Dalloway's shop mid-morning under the pretext of examining the coat once more. Miss Pettigrew, ever eager to assist, flitted about nervously as Perbrite handled the garment with deliberate care. He adjusted the coat slightly, lifting the collar and inspecting the lining, as if noticing a new detail, and then allowed his gaze to wander toward the shop door. It was a calculated move. Almost immediately a man approached, leaning casually on the threshold, but with eyes sharp and attentive. Perbrite recognized him from earlier observations, a local acquaintance of the magistrate, one whose movements had seemed casual, but whose attention to the coat now suggested a vested interest. "Inspector Perbrite," the man said, his voice even, almost too composed. "I trust the coat remains in good order?" "Indeed," Perbrite replied with measured calm. "Though I confess, one cannot help noticing small irregularities, creases, smudges, the occasional missing button. Curious, is it not, how minor details can attract attention?" The man's expression flickered for the briefest moment, subtle enough that any ordinary observer would miss it. But Perbrite noted the micro-expression carefully. It was curiosity mingled with apprehension, a reaction to observation that betrayed a concern beyond the ordinary. "I suppose minor imperfections are inevitable with travel," the man said, his tone steady but slightly strained. "One hopes they are not consequential." Perbrite allowed a polite pause, letting the remark linger. "Minor imperfections," he said gently, "often reveal more than we intend. Perhaps you would like to recount the coat's journey, or would that be presumptuous?" The man hesitated, adjusting his posture with a fleeting tension in the shoulders. Perbrite observed the careful control of every gesture, the deliberate pacing, the avoidance of direct eye contact, each behavior consistent with someone who had handled the coat with intent rather than mere accident. It was enough. Perbrite allowed the moment to extend, giving the man space to reveal, through silence and subtle cues, what words might not. And, as he had anticipated, the hesitation and the small signs of unease were telling. The individual had touched the coat deliberately, had known its presence in the shop, and had orchestrated actions to maintain secrecy while remaining close enough to observe the reactions of others. By the time the man departed, Perbrite had gathered more than direct testimony. He had observed the delicate choreography of concern, secrecy, and intent. The pattern, once fragmentary and subtle, was now coalescing. The coat's journey, the trivial disturbances and the behaviours of those surrounding it were no longer separate threads. They were part of a deliberate design, awaiting only the final elucidation. Purbright returned the coat to its cupboard with care. The experiment had succeeded. The guilty party had revealed themselves, not in confession, but in the faint tremor of attention and the almost imperceptible avoidance of scrutiny. In Flaxborough, subtlety was often louder than any declaration, and patience more revealing than any question. That evening he sat in his lodgings reflecting on the day's observations. The pieces were falling into place. The town's assumptions remained comfortably neat, the magistrate untouched by suspicion, and yet the truth, held in the invisible currents of behaviour and timing, was now within reach. The following morning, Perbrite invited the key figures to Mrs. Dalloway's shop under the pretext of examining the coat one final time. The town, as always, had a curious sense of occasion for even the most minor disturbances, and it did not take much for Mrs. Dalloway to summon a small, attentive audience. Mr. Pargeter arrived with his habitual courtesy, the magistrate unaware that his name would figure so prominently in today's discourse, while Miss Pettigrew hovered nervously in anticipation of what might unfold. Perbrite began with calm precision, speaking in his quiet, deliberate manner. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for attending. We are gathered today not for drama nor for recrimination, but to understand the curious series of events surrounding a coat that arrived here last week." He allowed a brief pause, observing the reactions of each person present. The air was polite, yet tinged with expectation. "The coat," he continued, "was returned by a gentleman who claimed it belonged to someone, yet was careful not to identify the owner. The town, in its admirable efficiency, concluded it must belong to Mr. Pargeter, and acted accordingly." He glanced at the magistrate, who inclined his head politely, still unaware of any misattribution. "Yet," Perbrite said, "as often occurs in Flaxborough, the truth lies not in our assumptions but in the subtleties, the crease in the shoulder, the faint tobacco scent, the small scuff upon the brass button, and most tellingly the measured attention given by those who handled the coat after it arrived." He picked up the missing button, holding it between thumb and forefinger. This button, misplaced as it was, and the observations of those present, reveal the true story. All eyes followed his gestures. Miss Pettigrew clutched her hands, leaning forward. Mr. Pargeter raised an eyebrow, polite yet curious. "The individual responsible for handling the coat with deliberate care," Perbrite continued, "was not attempting theft nor creating confusion for malice, but rather for personal reassurance and the testing of observation." His gaze fell gently upon the man who had lingered near the shop during Perbrite's test. "The coat was intentionally returned to this location. The crease, the scuff, the minor disturbances, they were not errors, but indications of careful attention, a silent performance to gauge how the town might respond." The man in question shifted, the subtle unease Perbrite had observed previously now fully visible, though his composure remained intact. Perbrite allowed the moment to stretch, letting the truth settle gently into the room. "The magistrate, Mr. Pargeter, has played no part beyond polite speculation. The town's assumption, though understandable, was therefore misplaced. The real narrative," Purbright said, inclining his head toward the observer, lies in human behavior, attention to detail, anticipation of reaction, and the subtle orchestration of minor anomalies. The coat, in short, was a carefully managed instrument of observation. A faint murmur ran through the assembled crowd. Miss Pettigrew's eyes widened, Mrs. Dalloway pursed her lips in appreciation of the logic, and Mr. Pargeter smiled faintly, inclining his head toward Perbrite with understated approval. The man, now acknowledged, offered a polite nod, accepting the quiet exposure without protest. Perbrite concluded with a soft, measured tone. The mystery was never one of ownership, but of human nature. In Flaxborough, the extraordinary is often hidden in the most ordinary of objects, and clarity arises not from force or confrontation, but from careful observation of gesture, timing, and subtle deviation from expectation. The coat has served its purpose. The town may now return to its usual routines, wiser for the demonstration of both discretion and curiosity. There was a moment of silence, followed by polite acknowledgement. The audience dispersed gradually, reassured, enlightened, and entertained in equal measure. The coat, now resting in its cupboard, was no longer a source of speculation, but a quiet testament to the delicate interplay of intention and observation. Perbrite, having observed the resolution with his customary patience, allowed himself a small smile. Flaxborough's routines, once gently disturbed, would resume, yet the lesson of subtle human complexity would linger. By the following week, Flaxborough had largely returned to its accustomed rhythm. The market square bustled with the familiar hum of polite commerce. The florist arranged blooms with meticulous care, and the railway buffet filled with quiet conversation and the faint aroma of boiled tea. The coat, now securely tucked away in Mrs. Dalloway's cupboard, was no longer the subject of speculation, its story fully understood by those who had participated in its gentle drama. Miss Pettigrew moved through the shop with a new sense of attentiveness, occasionally glancing at the cupboard and recalling the subtle lessons she had learned about observation and discretion. She lingered briefly over the shawls, thoughtfully adjusting displays with the care of someone who had seen how small details could reveal far more than the obvious. Mr. Pargeter, the magistrate, resumed his usual walks along Regent Street, bowler hat tilted at its familiar angle, exchanging polite nods with townsfolk who, while still a little curious, now understood that his role had been one of unwitting prominence rather than culpability. He smiled faintly when passing Mrs. Dalloway, acknowledging her quiet pride in having hosted the mystery's resolution without fuss. Even the man who had orchestrated the coat's journey blended once more into the town's routines. He moved with deliberate calm, engaging in ordinary activities, his earlier attention to small gestures now a silent anecdote that would remain private. In Flaxborough, life was resilient. Small anomalies created ripples, yet the river of daily habit carried on, absorbing disturbances without disruption. Perbrite returned to his modest lodgings, his ledger filled with careful notes and observations. The case, as he reflected, had been a demonstration of the extraordinary within the ordinary, a coat, a crease, a smudged button, and the attentiveness of human beings had produced a quietly intricate story. It was not a matter of malice, theft, or dramatic revelation, but of subtlety, observation, and the gentle interplay of human intentions. He poured himself a cup of tea, settled by the window, and watched as the mist lifted from the cobblestones. Flaxborough moved with its habitual pace, unconcerned, polite, and orderly. And yet in its quiet corners, he knew, life remained full of minor disruptions, unnoticed gestures, and delicate narratives waiting to be observed. The coat had passed through the town like a soft whisper, leaving behind nothing but small lessons in attention and civility. A reminder that in Flaxborough, mysteries never arrived with fanfare, but always quietly, in plain sight. Perbrite placed his pen carefully on the ledger, leaned back, and allowed the calm to settle over him. The work was done, the pattern fully revealed, and the town, none the wiser in its outward routines, carried on. The ordinary, he noted, was often the most extraordinary of all.